Two contrasting takes on history class in our schools from the Times. Schools urged to teach less British history. On the other hand, according to the Daily Express, hardly any of our children are getting any real history at all. Quote, British children failed on history learning, says new research. Many years ago, the Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, said to me that he wanted to teach history to Aussie school children as, quote, an heroic national narrative. Of course, there are always blemishes. You'll recall Cromwell's injunction to his portrait painter to paint him warts and all. But these days with British history, we paint just the warts, and that has consequences. For example, just 1 in 5 of those aged 18 to 24 have a positive view of Winston Churchill. A decade or so back, when the cancel culture got going, I modified Andy Warhol's line that in the future, everyone would be famous for 15 minutes to, in the future, everyone will be Hitler for 15 minutes. But reality has effortlessly outpaced me. To the nation's youth, Churchill is literally Hitler. Congratulations to our educators. David Starkey is back with us. Do you sometimes feel that the profession of historian is in fact threatened by this contemptuous attitude to the past? If the past is all wicked, why do we need guys like you?
I think the trouble is the profession of history, like most professions, is committing suicide. I think that's the position that we really need to be taking about. These kind of things actually begin within the academy. They don't come from outside the academy, they actually start within the academy. The problem is of course, that we use things like cancel culture. What we've got to understand is that there are two different ways of looking at the world. One is there is right and wrong, for these absolute principles. You know, racism is wicked. Anybody who's guilty of racism, like D. Starkey or H. Hitler or W.S. Churchill, end of view. There is another view which it says the world is a very complicated place. To judge it, you need to look at detailed evidence of behaviour, of action, of pressure, of circumstance, of value. And you arrive at judgments which weigh all of those things against each other and build into an overall pattern. Our problem is that the cancel culture, liberalism, it's that overall. It's essentially French. It's right. Descartes. It's the notion that you have a series of absolute principles or values. I was lucky as a boy. My mother taught me the problem with that approach. My mother's favourite word was principle. And I learned at the age of 7 what a principle was. Let me give you a definition of a principle. Mark, it is something that you feel so strongly about that you won't listen to reason on the subject. That's a principle. And we've now completely altered our method of judgment, of politics, of historical figures, of art, into deduction from, is this right? Does it promote equality? Does it promote freedom? Does it promote race relations? Rather than the proper way, which is the English, the scientific, the British way, which is inductive, looking at evidence. And there's an incredible paradox. The great revolution in the teaching of history in schools was to try to introduce children to the idea of evidence, to looking at facts and constructing argument from it. But of course, it never worked because the children couldn't understand it, so they're just indoctrinated.
But wouldn't, today they would say, oh, well, our feelings are more important than being able to look at evidence. But aren't they actually losing a lot of that too? I mean, obviously you don't have any sense of empathy. If you can't grasp, say, that until the 1950s, one continent, Europe, entirely owned another continent, Africa, and
the world. Rephrase. Essentially, the Anglo-American world owned the world.
Yeah, but so it's not a choice of it's not the British Empire versus some utopia. It's the choice of whether you would prefer to be colonized by the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, even the Belgians. That's the choice. And if you can't even understand that, than the entirety of human history.
And that on the whole, it was rather better to be colonised by the British than by anybody else, because uniquely, of course. But again, you see, empire, bad. It's this simple ticking exercise, good, bad. Empire, of course, is highly complex. Similarly is industrialisation, something else we're debating. What we've got to understand is that Britain effectively invents modernity. The empire is the beginning of globalization. Our industrial revolution is the beginning of this extraordinary world that we're in now. Right, the industrial revolution produces pollution. Yes, of course, terrible. We should start paying reparations. It's also the reason that people live longer, live better, live disease-free. But all you will get is somebody who really should know better, like David Attenborough, prattling about how wicked industrialisation is. What we've got to do, we've to go back and to try to get people to understand that there has to be balance. There has to be, argument from every... Because, it applies to our actual politics. What's gone wrong with our politics is exactly the same thing.
Well, no, I mentioned to Peter Tatchell, who's an awfully pleasant fellow, but in Australia, for example, he wants all these towns and states, like his hometown, Melbourne, and the state, Victoria, to give up those names and be replaced by Aboriginal names. And somehow to enter into debate on that sort of seems to miss the point.
It's deranged. It's simply deranged.
We won, they lost. That may be embarrassing to you, but it's a fact of life, and we should all
And also,
accept
do you
it.
know what? What we should be saying is, OK, very tough that the Stone Age people suffered. What Australia has created, what the British Empire created to Australia, is one of the most interesting, productive, economically, culturally, everything else, creative societies in the world. And again, the legacy of colonisation in America, because what we really must remind ourselves is the biggest example of the suppression of a native people is not Australia. It is the United States of America, which is effectively complete wipeout. Nevertheless, this has always happened. The reason, for example, that in most colonial empires, if we're looking at South America, if we're looking in India, the reason those empires, in other words, why Spain is... 102 Spaniards able to conquer the Aztecs and the Incas. Similarly...
And not because they were peace-loving ninnies, they were actually very violent societies.
As we know, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, the ripping out of hearts from live bodies. So violent militaries. But their empires, the Aztecs were an empire, the Incas were an empire. So when you decapitate the empire, 100 people with guns... dealing with people who don't have guns, the famous Kipling line, we have the Gatling gun and they do not. Similarly, India, the reason the British, a tiny number of British troops, again, in competition with the French, take India, is because you were dealing with the crumbling Mughal Empire. So again, the idea is that empires are uniquely Western and uniquely wicked. But we've got to see that the empire, Britain, is the essential vehicle of modernity. If you want your Apple computer, if you want your game things, if you want to live disease-free, if you want to have children most of whom will not die in infancy, I'm afraid you need industrialisation. You need emissions, you need nastiness.
And that's what actually the British Empire brought to a lot of those places.
Everywhere.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm basically a 19th century imperialist, 100 years past my sell-by date.